Very, very happy to welcome Michael Zavros here to the stage. Michael is a leading Australian artist renowned for his photorealistic drawings and paintings, and following his studies in printmaking at the Queensland College of Art. Michael was subsequently awarded a lot of things. The Jacaranda Acquisitive Drawing Award in 2002, the Robert Jacks Drawing Prize in 2005, the QAGOMA Prize in 2007, and in 2010 he won the Doug Moran National Portrait Prize, and in 2012 the inaugural Bulgari Art Prize. He's exhibited widely and internationally with shows at Art Basel Hong Kong in 2015, Los Angeles Contemporary in 2016. He has held numerous international residencies in New York, Milan, Barcelona. He is the creator of one of my favorite paintings, not only in QAGOMA, but anywhere, Bad Dad. I love this painting. We're going to talk about it a bit later. And let's welcome Michael. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start by saying that, I've met Michael. We met for the first time last week, but as soon as I met him, I thought, we're going to be friends. Like this,
we only got through 2 or 3 paintings as well.
Yeah, we met for coffee, and then the idea was to go through the show and talk about it and figure out what we were going to talk to you about today. And I quickly realized that there is so much to draw upon here because Michael has, I think, an avid interest in old master paintings, and that shone through when we were going through the show, and it shines through for me as an art historian when I look at your work and I see different, for me, Bad Dad has a lot of Caravaggio in there, and I think that's something that's come through in the various talks that have happened around that show, of that work rather. So I think maybe for starters, it would be really interesting for everyone to hear about your rapport relationship with these old masters, and maybe about travels that you've gone on, these various residencies, how you've interacted with them in the past or present.
Yeah, sure.
At present.
And I think initially as a kid growing up on the Gold Coast and coming from a family where there wasn't a lot of books and not a lot of art, and not seeing a lot of art, but just having this ability, and my parents excited that I can do this, and I go off to painting lessons and do gum trees and stuff, but all of this that we're looking at was so foreign and so exotic, and things that I could access sometimes in books, and it really wasn't for a few decades before I could actually see these things in the flesh. And it's funny, I sent you that funny image yesterday of me. After I graduated art school, I had this business painting trompe-l'oeil paintings, which was a big thing in the 90s. There was this neoclassicism sort of coming through in architecture and interior design, and everyone on the Gold Coast was pulling out palm trees and putting in poplar trees and painting their modernist 80s homes Tuscan yellow and putting in shutters, and everyone wanted a view out onto Greece and Italy, or wanted a ceiling painted. And so I had this business before I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to make or doing that on the side, but it was this strange kind of introduction to a kind of a classicism, I suppose, and just suddenly study artists like Tiepolo and to rip them off on ceilings and things, and it was, I'd not seen these things, and it wasn't until I got to a Milan Residency through the Australia Council, this incredible program that they had for 40 years, which is now largely diminished, but yeah, that Milan Residency was the first one that I went to, and just having access to this stuff that I knew of and that was a part of my blood, and all of this, it was a fascinating revelation for me, and seeing this Tiepolo ceiling at Villa Pisani that I had ripped off many times. It's a very typical Australian story in lots of ways. I've sort of come from this place and accessing it in odd ways before I can truly connect, and then later connect in a richer and richer way. In a way that's had become, meaningful to me as an artist.
And did that become a large part of your practice while you were on these residencies, or going, looking, thinking about that kind of visual culture that hadn't been accessible to you here?
Yeah.
Like, did it become an important aspect of your training?
Yeah, and always at the time. And often those residencies, you're reporting your grant because it's a development grant, and they are outcome based in some ways. I'd go, and often I was making a show that had to be made somewhere back at home while I was on residency. And I quite like that because I don't want to be out all day. I like to do something and then go out. Whereas Alison can be out all day, whereas I need quiet time. But it was always later that whatever I was looking at and whatever I was absorbing, I'd go home and then it would explode, and I'd think, what am I getting out of this? I love it all, but it's percolating, you know.
Do you ever sketch on site? Is that something?
No, I wasn't one of those artists that you see in museums doing this a lot. If I did, I was faking it. But I like Caravaggio. I get straight into it. But look, sometimes I do, but very, very rarely. I take a lot of photos. I feel like I'm needing to collect things. I'm always collecting stuff. You'll see our place one day.
Yeah.
But collecting images, these resource images, and it's like collecting memories or things that I would access or respond to later.
When you saw that the Met show was coming and the wonderful Caravaggio it includes, did that excite you? Was it sort of a big... we'll look at it in a minute.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, a residency. I went to New York for the first time on Australia Council residency. I was one of the last artists in Green Street, which we'd had for 40 years. And I went to the Met so many times and just thought, this place is incredible. I knew so much about the Met and knew so many of the works that were there, and have subsequently gone back to New York, maybe 4 or 5 times as I've had a chance to show in the States. But it's almost a little bit sacrilegious that these things would come to me. And as lucky as we all are, sometimes I think I don't think this is right. You know, we grow up as people who love these things and are studying these things, and we make these almost faith-like pilgrimages to these things. And when they come to me, I'm like, I don't know about this. It's very exciting, but I feel a bit.
Michael, I hear you, because I can relate to that just in my own practice and as an art historian. You know, in Canada, like this, you know, as I said in my introduction there, like Kingston, it's a small town, but like the pilgrimage we as art history students would take to New York, we'd get in, you know, a bus and go down, and we had no money, so we'd eat bread and but study all this art. And like, again, I can hear exactly that in what you're saying, this kind of idea that they were somehow works removed from us. And then I think that's why it's helpful sometimes to think of those paintings as I said at the outset, like these immigrants, that they don't belong in New York entirely either. So it's just all about movements and travels and currents of ideas. And I find it fascinating to hear about your travels in that way. But I thought another thing that we should talk about would be technique. And you know, I loved going through the show with you, and you know, the finesse with which you were looking at the application of paint and the details and what shines through when you understand that difference between tempera and oil. And was that something, because then I asked Michael, I said, does anyone use tempera anymore? He's like, no. So it's definitely a mode that isn't used anymore, but it was so ubiquitous for so long. And that transition to oils, like, I just wonder if you could reflect on that, because you are someone who works in that mode, and what does it mean to you to be able to look and see these nuances in terms of technique in the show as it is here? Yeah,
and look, I loved your lecture and covering so much of that, but it's almost the limitations of the egg tempera that make it so beautiful and make the application of that medium what it is and what we love about it. And I didn't know much about egg tempera when we were talking the other day, and you asked me to talk to you about what I was seeing, and I assumed, because of the line work, you know, when you go and see this work, and I would encourage you all to take a good look at the Glandia work in the flesh, it's just made up of these incredibly beautiful calligraphic lines. It almost looks like those engraved lines that we see on banknotes, you know, the beautiful sort of swirling lines. And I said to you, I think egg tempera dries quickly, and the paints don't like to mix, the colours don't like to mix. And then I went home and I did the research, and I was right. But when you look at it, this flesh tone is made up of completely contrasting colours. It is literally greens and reds, the opposite sides of the colour wheel, sitting right next to each other, so that when you step back from it, you see flesh. But those colours don't want to talk to each other the way that the way that
Yeah.
later they would. And this artist had very little time to work with these
Yeah.
paints. He's making them fresh with egg yolk and pigment and not much else. And as we all know, egg. You can't move it. It stays on that fry pan for a long time, and so archivally these things are incredible. You know, they're lasting hundreds of years beautifully because you can't shift that egg. But it's
Well
drying.
put.
It's drying so fast. So he needs
Yeah.
to find ways to manipulate this medium, and that in itself just creates this beautiful linear work and sort of lends itself to the almost it's still coming out of the Dark Ages, so there are these very careful stylized lines that we make out of hair or out of a form itself.
A very linear kind of approach. I think you're exactly right there.
There's a nice flatness that I admire about it.
And then thinking about the oils
Yeah.
and the glazing and what the potential there, and just as you said, that kind of mixing of tones that's possible.
So suddenly, linseed oil is just slow drying and mixing in a very similar way pigment with this base medium. The different colours will talk to each other, the different tones will talk to each other, and you can get this lovely spectrum across the Virgin's cheek there of different tones and different colours. It's actually compared to, say, the Titian coming up, which is, you see reds and oranges and pinks, it's still quite monochromatic. It's still, the browns and ivory colours that the artist is exploring, but it's much more three-dimensional. He can get really into contrast and throw shadows between these two figures that are embracing and really give us a sense of this thing having some depth. And of course, then the connection between those two figures, it allows him that lovely emotive composition that he's.
Well, let's look at I think I have Titian here. That was something else I really wanted to talk to you about, because when we looked at this in the show, you were saying how mythology matters to you as a mode to work in. And I love hearing that from a contemporary artist, because sometimes mythology is almost, I don't know, a little bit derided as old-fashioned or, not as contemporary a mode to be in. And I know this is the work that you spoke to in the sort of promotion material around the show, so it obviously resonates for you. And maybe just thinking a little bit about mythology as a mode of engagement and why that's important in your own practice.
Yeah. Well, mythology, I guess, matters to me in lots of ways. It's a way for me to connect to my Greek heritage and something that's fascinated me since I was a little kid. And you sort of, again, it's that Australian story. You sort of look in the mirror, you start to learn things about who you are and where you've come from and what's not a part of your life now, but maybe once was. And so that's always fascinated me and been a basis for so much of my practice. And I think too, mythology just offers so many wonderful cautionary tales to our contemporary existence constantly. I mean, especially narcissism. But I think, and I was thinking today when I was looking at some of these works and how mythology is. It's like a safe space for a lot of artists and writers now. We find ourselves in times where we have to swim in our lanes. You're really not supposed to touch anything that is not authentic to you or doesn't belong to you anymore. And it curtails freedoms for artists thinking that way. But mythology is this universal playground, I think, still. So I've just read this fantastic novel by this Massachusetts art historian, Madeline, I've forgotten her name, but she's written, called The Song of Achilles. It's this fantastic retelling of Homer's Iliad, and she's writing from the perspective of Patroclus and his gay love for Achilles. Now, she's a woman. You get in trouble for doing those sorts of things these days. She's clearly not swimming in her lane, but she's working in mythology, and I find that fascinating. It is still an area of open exploration, for us being authentic. But I think I've spoken about this work being just such a great design piece, and you get a sense, unlike the Caravaggio getting straight into it, that he worked on this for a long time and really composed in terms of color composition and perspective, and the way these figures are intertwining, and who's going to catch the light, and how that's going to be how that's going to just glow against Adonis there. And it feels quite claustrophobic. If I was drawing this, I might give it some more space outside of the dogs there, or outside of her foot. But I think that adds to the panic that we feel as the audience. I think there's a lot of things that are so subtle we can barely pick up on. But the longing and the doom, I think, is just writ large because of just brilliant composition and design.
And also here, thinking about a session called Flesh to Fashion, and the flesh on display here, and just thinking about how Titian, and it's interesting if you look at it matched up with the other paintings from this series, the Poesie. He's so happy here to show the figure from behind, and that dorsal view, and like the figure in the round, that becomes such an important aspect of painter's strength. Like, I can show the back and the front too, and I'm good at both, and that is at play here. And I think the emotional resonance there is really important, because a lot of scholars have talked about how Titian is deviating from he's making an interesting artistic choice in showing Venus clinging to Adonis, don't go, whereas previously it was the other way around. It's Venus, I'm out of here, so it's that decision. And when painters make those choices, I think it's really fascinating. So, but what you just said about mythology really resonated. It can sort of be a box you're working within, but then you can find new ways of making it shine and have a contemporary resonance. So that's really...
Yeah, I just love that twist in her trunk there. It's like these gnarls, sort of,
Oh, it's great.
It's so fascinating, though, when you think about... if you look at the Wikipedia entry on this Titian, there'll be like 10 copies. But it all came from the same workshop, and that was just de rigueur. That's what artists did in those days, and it's not necessarily even a commercial imperative. It's just what artists did. People have seen that one, and that's the one that they want. And
completely.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing at all.
Two artists in this era, like me replicating something now would be. I know. Why would you do that? That's so inauthentic. It's so.
But it was de rigueur then. It was, and that's the Rubens work in our collection after Titian. That is a really, really important work that we need to do more thinking about. And that's exactly that mode. He's looking at that prototype, copying it, and then uses it to another end. And that practice and that pedagogy, I think, is really an important aspect of looking at the art of this period. And like you say, so copies are very interesting to me. But let's go look at this. So, because I said to Michael, when I look at your work, I think Caravaggio. I just can't, it's just there. And I'm so happy to say that. And of course, we'll look at Bad Dad in a second. And you've mentioned Caravaggio as someone important to your work. I just would love to hear your thoughts on this painting and why it matters and why it might resonate with thinking about Bad Dad in a second, in terms of approach to composition and things like that.
I think Caravaggio is so interesting because he's this bad boy. He's this sexually hungry guy. His work is so sensuous and so sexual. He's violent and divisive, and we're so aware of his presence in his work. He's putting himself in his practice all the time. This is what he wants to do. This is what he's interested in, and that's something that I've always connected with. I'm so often either criticism or writing about my work talks about it always being some sort of a self-portrait, that I'm always in my practice, that I'm giving back to this thing, technically and conceptually, I suppose. But I think that when I look at his work, I'm so aware of the presence of this guy and what he wants to show us, and that he's painting almost not for an audience. He's making a Caravaggio for Caravaggio, and you look at these models, and I don't know whether they are different models, but they all look very similar. They could be the same guy in different poses, and as you say, he gets straight into it. There's not a lot of planning here. and it's almost the mistakes. We're getting into sacrilegious territory again. But it's almost the things that we might see as mistakes now that make this such an interesting work. So there is writing about a work like this. I'm pretty sure I can remember just these figures being on different planes almost, like it isn't planned. The figure in the furthest in the background, his head is quite large. It's almost.
And possibly a self-portrait even.
Possibly, and yet what's interesting about that is that's the only figure that has our eye contact, and so it's interesting that he has a larger head. So in terms of perspective, compositional perspective, it would be smaller. There are things like that where these figures are not quite connecting the way that the Titian felt like a very sort of perfect piece of design. But that's almost what's great about Caravaggio's work as well. And I read the fantastic essay by Chris about this work just evoking all of our senses. So it's about touch. It's such a sensual work. It's about touch and scent and taste, even as Cupid is reaching for the grapes there. But I love it. I think he's... I just see that. I think they're all the same guy whenever I look at it, or it's the same version that Caravaggio wants to give us. He puts those lady eyebrows on all of them, and those sort of cute button noses and very full, often parted lips.
And there's a whole element around cosmetics because when I flipped through the Rococo section, because what I wanted to talk about there a little bit was cosmetics and the application of paint, the application of like there's a kind of interesting analogy to think about there, and I think about that with Caravaggio too. Like the flesh tones are very ruddy, and it's almost that the erotic element comes through with that sometimes as well. Like they're flush with wine, and wine linked up with seduction and all these kinds of things.
It's very decadent.
Yes, yes. Okay. Now, but it's like a flash of color. It's just it's so fabulous. I love this painting. And, obviously the links with the Caravaggio Narcissus, which, that's been discussed and thought through. And, and of course a kind of more pop art sensibility as well with the colors and almost like Jeff Koons with the balloon. But I don't know, looking at this work, just, I guess, reflecting on it now, it was painted 2013, and to me it is a stellar work, one of my favorite paintings in this collection. Thinking about it now, does that kind of me linking it up to that artisterial tradition, is that something you embrace and see in a positive, like Michael, you are like the contemporary Caravaggio. But
it's incredibly flattering.
But I do, your approach to paint, it has a kinship.
Well, it's absolutely reaching out to those artists and to be connected in any way. In the aftermath, it is lovely, but I can't say it any other way than that I was thinking about and looking at and reaching out to those sorts of players and. Just, I came home from that residency and having looked at those things and deciding to make this work and to play with even composition in a completely different way and to think about placing pool toys and pool noodles so as they are leading lines and but then to use composition in a conceptual way so that they maybe talk about children in absence and that's something Caravaggio just did so beautifully, especially his depiction of Narcissus. His compositional arrangement became conceptual, and I think that is just so powerful. We look to contemporary artists for these big ideas constantly, and as you've pointed out in your lecture, we can mine this show for the same sorts of things that we would get in a fantastic APT, or it's all of these. They're just human ideas and. Yeah. You said it better than I did, but
and this idea of photorealism, does that how do you feel about that kind of characterization of Caravaggio? Because something we talk about a lot with Caravaggio is his relationship to film sometimes, or theater, like this spotlight effect,
very theatrical,
and as I said, like a denial of background, like so a kind of particular kind of cinematic quality sometimes that can emerge with his work. And photorealism is another. So is that a kind of characterization you're comfortable with, or like is it?
Yeah, look, I do work from photography and like to mimic that to a point, but certainly with this work, I stopped making a kind of photorealism that I think we're going to talk about the other work at the top of the stairs, which had a kind of a more slavish attention to the photograph as a subject in and of itself and an application, whereas this work was painted a lot like old master works with actually composite images as well. So I'm mimicking the photographic mark in some ways, but I'm putting lots of them together, and so it's very imperfect. I mean that I've taken that perspective way higher than it would have been. I mean that the line of the edge of the pool would have been right behind me. That's not an Olympic pool we have at home, but I wanted him floating in this blue sea of like it's that sense of blue nothingness. You know that the figure is. So it's that kind of play, I think, that is, I suppose, post-photorealism. It's taking what I need from it or what I want and rejecting quite a lot.
Yeah. And Michael, in his work, also represents the two themes of the show, states of dress and undress. So here we're moving into states of dress. And this fabulous paint, you can see it's at the top of the escalator, I think, leading up to level 2. And you know, when putting together the slides for the show, I just thought, we have to look at Michael's suits, and he's actually very appropriately dressed today in a pinstripe.
It's a little tight, but...
So I was just thinking about these works too, because I think what's really intriguing I just talked about figures in the round. I don't know, for me, the composition of these works is really interesting, because there's an anonymity, in fact, because the heads are gone. I've just spent all this in the lecture talking about identities of sitters and so on and so forth. And here, we have that resolute focus on the state of dress. And I just wondered if there was, if that resonates with you as like when thinking about elements of fashion in art, and maybe just speak to this work a little bit for us. Yeah.
The first one of these I made in the late 90s, I think it was 99, and I'd torn this image out of a magazine of what I thought that I wanted to wear to my wedding. And I didn't own a suit, and I was very interested in owning a suit and having a suit or being like these guys. But I was a young artist, and I don't know, I just never had a suit. And so this thing was sitting on my desk, and it was a fairly typical fashion image of a headless figure. Just showing a suit and a tie, and I found this interesting. It's very a typical fashion image, but I thought if I painted that, it would suddenly become a portrait in absence of subject, and all of these other things would happen. So it was very post-80s kind of straightforward appropriation, and I'd find these images and I'd say, I like that, and I'm going to cut the head off that, and I'm going to crop this in such a way. But yes, absolutely states of fashion, and what are these hallmarks of masculinity, and what is this attention to detail saying about the kind of painting that I want to make? And it was a kind of narcissism starting to emerge where what I'm making and how I'm doing it kind of mirror each other. It's this attention to details and reveling in that, and this artist sort of giving back to themselves. And it's interesting, I think, how much works like this can change. Our reading of things change, and you pointed to that in your lecture. So much changes. At the time I made these works, and I'm thinking about masculinity and luxury and signs and coding and those sorts of things, and how I'm finding this fascinating, and how it's really not me, but I'm sort of drawn to it. And later I'm buying suits and I'm painting myself in suits, or I'm painting the things that I have, and yet a work like this at the time, so 20 years ago, you couldn't make a work that contained the male figure or about masculinity without drawing a homoerotic tag somehow within a piece of writing. It's going to come up, and then within a few years of that, and there's nothing particularly homoerotic about this at all, but within a few years of that term suddenly started to lose currency, and we men occupy a full spectrum of sexuality like everybody else does now, and you don't really use a term like that anymore. And then I'm looking at that at the top of the stairs just now in the break, and I'm thinking, I I think a work like this is going to draw a white male privilege tag now, and it's so fascinating. We as
we can never win.
but over time, and I find that fascinating. When I go back to look at art that I've loved for decades, I've changed, and the world that work lives in changes, but the work hasn't changed, and the work we load it up, as you say.
Yeah.
But I see different things, or I'm experiencing different things because of the world that we live in now, and we take different meaning from things that have been sitting there for centuries waiting to speak to us again, because the world is changing so much. And when Bad Dad came out, there was one particular critic that often has a go at me, was talking about how can this work not reference children overboard? The children are clearly referenced by their absence, and by the title of the work, it's Bad Dad. And then, but with the passage of time, that issue is no longer topical, and so of course that was a long bow and a bit of an odd thing to say. But the way we read these things, I love that. I love the way that our works,
Yes.
and so they live. These things are alive.
That's absolutely it, and that was kind of what I was trying to say around the works. And they have lives. They aren't just stuck in a particular box. They live different lives in their movements, and then they take and acquire new shifting contingencies and meanings and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think one last, we're kind of five. Michael has done extraordinary work in this realm. Just then when you were talking about, I was thinking about how mannequins often are headless, aren't they? And that's, anyway. And these wonderful detail-oriented visions of men's fashion. And then finally, I just really wanted to quickly get your thoughts on this Paolo Veronese work, because I'm completely fascinated by how in men's fashion, legs, men's legs for a long, with Henry VIII, it was legs, whoa, that was a scandal. We often think about women's fashion, and in the show we head up to the Rococo, and there's the décolletage, and I mentioned something about the exposure of breasts and so on and so forth. But with men's fashion, and you're the right person to talk to, but there is this shifting condition. It was very scandalous in the period, initially, to have the legs, and that's what I meant by subversion of social norms, because the shifts and changes in men's fashion in particular are really fascinating to chart and think through. And with the Veronese, yes, this very fashionable doublet and the ballooned tunic, this. And then you have this very public presentation. Again, a work from our show, work from our collection that is just extra. This is a very public presentation. The one on the left, a bit more for a seclusion in a home, and the one on the right, a very public presentation. But not in terms of specifics, but just thinking about men's fashion and its evolution and charting that as a point of interest. Does looking at the Veronese generate anything for you in terms of thinking?
I was looking at it this morning, and actually I made Alison look at it too, and she made this great observation, and I'd sort of been thinking this, but she said that looks like Gucci runway right now. That's exactly that's exactly what Alessandro Michele. He's looking to the past, but men's fashion is changing very fast. This silhouette that sort of looks like a body shape for guys is leaving very quickly, and it's not just like the New Romantics, I think, in the 80s, and Boy George, and a little bit of dress up and play. I think it is becoming very entrenched in the next generation. My daughters look at Harry Styles on the red carpet, and he's in what we would have called a little while ago drag, but he's just wearing high heels and a dress. And that is no longer even femme. It's just what men are wearing, and it's changing very quickly. I find this fascinating.
Veronese is a poster boy for Gucci. It's fabulous.
It's in-house, really, when you think about it.
And if you think of things like the Met Gala and just what happens there, and that circuitous thing, and the revival of past fashion. Well, it is. I'm 10 minutes over. I cannot do well. We could take a few questions from the audience, if you have any, in particular for Michael, since he's here with us just today. Are there any questions or thoughts that you have about, any of this? Does anyone?
Oh, and we'll get you to call out quite loudly, because you don't have to
Yes. Ash.
Because with your Bad Dad painting, you said it was painted really similarly to like old, Caravaggio and things like that. I'm just wondering what you mean by that, and I just noticed I love Baroque and intersecting lines and all that stuff, and so I noticed a bit of that going on with the use of intersecting lines and the gaze. And
Yeah.
so,
No, you're right, and I didn't get to that, but just compositionally, yes, the cross of that bunny.
Oh, I can repeat it. So the question was from Ash, and she was asking about Bad Dad and the diagonals and intersection of lines as a kind of Baroque aesthetic to it, and wanted to know more about Michael's inspiration from the Baroque period. Okay.
Yeah, look, so compositionally, you're right with the cross there, with the reflection is providing this perfect sort of dissection of the canvas, and I was looking for something like that, but because of Caravaggio's, very clever void right in the middle of his Narcissus, that the arm creates with its reflection this empty space, which is just the strangest thing, but it speaks so perfectly about the longing and the loss, this goddess feeling, but. I think just technically, it was one of the first times that I started to really play with layers the way that artists have for centuries, and artists like the ones we're looking at would start with an imprimatur and a ground, like a middle ground tone, and then explore things in a monochromatic way before colour comes on the top. And sure enough, I get this painting that is so much brighter and so much more pop. Than anything that I'd been making previously, because I'm first exploring it in a tonal way, and then I can come on top with much purer layers of transparent bright colours. And again, it's just it was a wonderful way that artists can speak to us. I was looking more at still life, just thinking, how is this tulip 500 years later just glowing out of in the dark? It's that sort of thing. I was just. And seeing things in the flesh, it was just wonderful to just stand there and get a sense of how those layers are sitting on that surface.
Yeah, I think we really do agree that it's important to look at the actual work and reproduction. You do lose something in that, and in a moment of the digital humanities, I worry that we're going to lose something if we don't keep looking at work. So we need more shows like this, Chris. just bring some more. Just any other questions? Yeah. Oh.
Can you explain, anybody, how tempera paint has withstood the test of time? Because as we know, egg, it doesn't last long.
No, I don't know why it's archivally so sound.
It is durable. I mean, when I think of tempera and I think about fresco, I mean, these do have durable longevity to them. When I talked about tempera and in contrast to oil, it wasn't to say tempera is a bad medium, it got eradicated. But the positive qualities that we've addressed here around layers and glazes and and then the way it just whole scale gets adopted in that way, because the deficiency of tempera, I mean, it does last, it does have true color, and it can stay, but it differs in, as we've been saying, that kind of flatness of application. And they're just wizards with their recipes. Like, there are all kinds of there's a famous handbook by Cennino Cennini from the 14th century where he talks about 15th, and he talks about the recipes for pigments and the recipes for and the pigments are ground and true, and they're not mass manufactured. They're from the minerals and what's needed to create. So it's that combination thereof that enables it to have a longevity, and it does have a longevity. It's just a different look and different possibilities. Like, with each technique, you have differences and different positives. it's not about saying one is better than the other. And I loved hearing you talk about tempera in such a positive way, because a lot of times in art history we're like, tempera, don't, and then that adoption. But anyway, so I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
The chemical compound of eggs is they're pretty miraculous
Yeah.
things. I know just from reading that they only wanted the yolk. They couldn't get any of the protein, which is the white, mixed with it. Otherwise, it wasn't going to last. But they're such miraculous things. I eat eggs every day, and we have chickens, and just see this little thing come out of this, and it's just, there has to be a miracle in there somewhere.
It's a miracle. These paintings are miracles.
They're miracles.
And they made mistakes. Like when I think of fresco as a technique, so painting on the wall, like making the paint part of the plaster.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of experimentation there that went foul. And they started trying to do fresco secco, so making just painting dry, and it just flaked off within a day. Or just think of the great technical experiments of the Renaissance, like Leonardo's Last Supper, where he's like, I'm going to mix oil and tempera. Let's see what happens. I don't like oil. I don't quite like tempera, so I'm just going to, then you have a technical disaster that ends up being restored over 20 years. But anyway, that's a whole other lecture. But yeah, other questions? Yeah. Hi.
I was wondering, when we're talking about a lot of the masters in the collection that use their work often with the subjectivity of the patron, but also the exploration of the self-portrait. I was wondering what thoughts you have as an artist who often features himself in their works. How do you feel like that transformation has shifted to the period you work in?
Wow.
It's interesting, talk about patrons and these artists that often would, I guess, sneak themselves into their practices. And I guess I'm lucky that those self-portraits, in some ways, they also have sold. So that doesn't put a grinding halt to that exploration for me, because I don't have a patron. Well, we have some patrons, don't we? But it's interesting for me. It's just become an increasing part of this performance, I suppose, between art and life, and how my life sort of enters my practice, and acknowledging that so much of what I do is a kind of a self-portrait anyway, and that's where the work draws its strength, rather than some vainglorious thing. It's about a kind of authenticity, I suppose, and trying to explore that. And I guess now face that. I mean, I'm faced with this guy with this luscious black hair, and I think the inexorable movement of time is right in front of you, and so I find that fascinating. I'm not sure that answered the question.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted your thoughts were on the notion that today maybe it's fashion that influences art, whereas in the Baroque period it was the other way. Art was influencing fashion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm not sure what.
Oh, say the question back. So the question is, in the Baroque period, it seems as if art influenced fashion, and now it's an inversion of those modes, that fashion is potentially influencing art. And that's a big, huge question.
I'm not sure that I agree necessarily. I think that fashion has an interesting relationship with art.
Yeah.
And I know more about this because my partner has studied it and written about it,
Yeah.
and how they have an uneasy relationship at times, because art is long and fashion is short, and they borrow from each other in various ways because of that. And so you get these collaborations, these hybridizations of all these different arts happening, including art and fashion. But I can think of artists who've gone the other way and made work about fashion. I've sought to in different ways. But
It makes me think about, again, the legs of Henry VIII, and how, when Henry VIII decided it was time for everyone to men to wear those stockings and show their legs, it was scandalous initially, but then it got adopted. And that's in part because of the delivery of that presence in portraiture. Like, there's this kind of, whole-scale workshop approach to, here's Henry VIII, and then that got adopted. So it's a very, I guess, I would add there, it's an interesting question to think about that relationship and how it could be an uneasy one, but how it could also be very verifiable to think about, you know, moments when you have particular elevated individuals who then set a style and how that happened through art primarily in that period, you know. So I think it's a really good question. Maybe I think we'll take
Just
one more question. Lucinda's. One more question, yes.
Well, it's actually two. I had a terrific interview you did either this year, early this year or last year on the arts show at Radio National, and you spoke about having a life-size model of yourself made and living.
Oh, yeah.
Do you still have that model?
Yes, he's a little worse for wear now, but he's still.
What is it? You made a life-size model?
Yeah, I made this mannequin of myself and shot him. I sort of interspersed him with my life and photographed him with my things or in my life. And I had a photographic show last year of those works, which I suppose it was photography, but with sculpture and painting
multimedia
embedded in this work. But yeah, he was. It was interesting.
Great question. On that note, thank you everybody for coming today. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Michael.
No, you're so
I
welcome.
enjoyed our
Thank you,
conversation.
everyone.
I'll see you.